All right, so welcome to our EarthBurned Activism Alliance Fundraiser Event. We are so excited to have you all here today to support the organizations UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, the Rainforest Project, and Earthjustice, and learn about environmental and social justice from our awesome speakers.
We'd like to tell you a little bit more about us. This is our mission statement. Welcome to EarthBurned, a youth-led nonprofit organization dedicated to fundraising and educating through intersectional environmentalism. Through various platforms, including online outreach, videos, free courses on various environmental and social justice topics, and the EarthBurned podcast, we provide engaging environmental and social justice content and accessible activism for all. Under our team of 4 founders and 13 global leaders, our growing international community of over 170 volunteers continues to hone their wide range of skills in crafting articles, original graphic designs, and unique classes. EarthBurn's journey of impact is just beginning, and we hope you join us in our fight for the future of our planet, one community at a time.
Now, my co-founders and I would like to introduce ourselves. We are all sophomores from Long Island, New York, and we founded EarthBurned in April 2020 to enhance our efforts in working toward environmental and social justice.
Hi, I'm Katie Ann. I'm 16, and I'm so grateful to be a leader of such a diverse and hardworking team here at EarthBurned.
Hello, I'm Kayla. I am also 16, and it has been so awesome to work with and meet so many different people from around the world and help lead EarthBurned.
Hi, I'm Juliet. I'm 15. I love working with and leading with this awesome EarthBurned team.
At EarthBurned, we offer a variety of teams and opportunities for people around the world to use their talents to fight for justice. We have an outreach team, a social media/writing team, a design team, a YouTube team, a newsletter team, a marketing team, a teaching team, a podcast team, and an events team.
Additionally, this past year, we have accomplished a great deal and cannot wait to continue meeting more goals. For instance, over 170 volunteers from 9 countries around the world, podcasts listened to internationally, hundreds of listens, Activism Alliance Fundraiser, our fundraiser goal of $200 to $225 raised so far, more than 4,000 Instagram followers, and free environmental and social justice courses, podcasts, blogs, and videos for hundreds of people.
Now, moving on to our event, our Activism Alliance fundraiser today aims to support organizations fighting for our planet and the people on it, and to support those affected by the coronavirus pandemic. 100% of the funds we collect will be divided and evenly donated to the Rainforest Project, Doctors Without Borders, Earthjustice, and UNICEF.
Here's some more information about the organizations we are donating to and why we chose to donate to them. Earthjustice is a nonprofit law organization that protects the rights of all people to a healthy environment. UNICEF is a nonprofit that advocates for the protection of children's rights and opportunities. Doctors Without Borders is an organization that offers medical relief to those affected by war epidemics and national disasters. And the Rainforest Project is an organization that focuses on commercial nature conservation in aging countries.
We would also like to give a big thanks to everyone who donated. Your donations will be used for some important impacts, so thank you so much again.
Moving on to our presentations today, we hope to inform you all of we hope to inform all of you in a variety of environmental and social justice topics to enhance the missions of these organizations.
First, we'll be hearing from our amazing speakers and having a Q&A with them before enjoying some trivia with awards. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we begin? Let me also check the participants. Okay. All right.
So before we begin, we're just going to run through our schedule for the speakers. From 4 to 4:20, we have Beth. 4:20 to 4:40, Murray Wilson. 4:40 to 5, Ngozi Chukwueke. 5 to 5:20, Miriam Castillo. 5:20 to 5:40, Ariel, Ouziel. 5:40 to 6, The Green Scene.
Okay, so with that, I guess we'll wait till 4 for the first speaker, so we'll just have a little break, and then we'll start with the speakers, just so that way everyone is on schedule.
Guys, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Coming to you from England, so thought the connection might be a bit dodgy. So hi, I'm Beth. So I'm going to talk to you today about sustainable and wildlife or eco-friendly gardening. So I've just got some slides to share. So I'll just share those with you now. Okay, so you should be able to see them now. Shout at me if you can't. So first of all, just a little bit about me. So I have a degree in biological sciences, and I'm currently studying a master's in energy and sustainable development. So I've sort of got a background in sort of ecology and conservation things from my degree, and now a bit more sort of climate change and sustainable development focus in my current master's. So I also run the blog talking about sustainability on the side of that, and the associated Instagram account, and that's basically to try and make some of these topics a bit more accessible and to provide some evidence-based educational resources. And so I just really enjoy being outside. So I really love walking and cycling, hiking, and gardening. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I just wanted to highlight some of the benefits of gardening to start with. So gardening can be really great for mental health. It helps with reducing stress and improving mood. It's just really great to be outside. Green spaces are really important for mental health, and so gardening is a really good hobby for that. It's also really great for our physical health. It's obviously an active hobby. You're outside in the fresh air, you're moving, so it's good for that. And I think it's also really great for improving our connection with nature. So I just think that if we do activities that connect us with nature, then it helps us to have a better awareness of our natural environment, and then we think more about our impacts on our natural environment, and so we just start thinking about environmental topics more. And so this can be a really great hobby to do with children. So if you've got kids or younger siblings, it's been shown that if you engage children with nature and their living environment early on in life, then they grow up to be more conscious of their impact and their connection with that as adults. So it's a really good way of sort of fostering a sort of pro-environmental stance for people as they grow up. And also, you get to be able to grow your own fruit and vegetables. Like, I totally believe even if you have a really small space, a balcony, a windowsill, there's still things you can grow that you can eat. And it's such a rewarding hobby in that sense, because, it's so great to be able to do something and then, have the reward of and the satisfaction of eating it at the end. And then plus, you get to be able to help your local wildlife, which is part of what I'm going to look at today. So I just wanted to start by making the distinction between what I consider to be sustainable gardening and wildlife friendly gardening. So this is actually a quote from a landscape gardener, Philip Johnson. So sustainable gardening is a means of designing, constructing and maintaining our spaces in a way that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think this is a little bit of a complicated or long-winded definition, but it's basically based on that sort of general definition for sustainable development, that we meet our needs now without compromising the needs of the future. So for gardening, for me, that basically means that we garden in a way that doesn't make natural resources deteriorate for future generations. So that's sort of the underpinning principle for that. And then, so wildlife friendly gardening is a little bit more what it says on the tin. So it's basically gardening in a way that positively impacts your local wildlife. So first of all, some sort of practical tips for sustainable gardening. So one of the big things you can do is try and collect rainwater and then use that to water plants in the garden, or even in your house, because basically it's not ideal, especially if you've got a big area, to be using fresh water from the tap all the time to be watering plants, because as we know, conserving fresh water is really important. So we can use rainwater, which is actually better for the plants, and then avoids using up tap water all the time. Also, it's quite hard to avoid plastic in gardening. So a lot of plants that you buy will come in plastic pots. It's kind of hard to avoid that. But if you really look after them, you can reuse them year after year. But you just need to make sure you bring them in cold weather to protect them from the frost, because that causes the plastic to become more brittle and then they'll start breaking. It's particularly useful if you plant seedlings in the spring, because you'll probably need loads of pots for a really short space of time, and then you'll plant those plants out and then not use them again until next year, so it's not really feasible for a lot of people financially to have all terracotta pots for that purpose. So just make sure you look after the plastic ones. You can also collect fallen leaves to make leaf mold, which is basically a soil conditioner. And that's a great way of using something that you would usually find a bit of a nuisance, probably clear up and maybe throw away. So that's a great way of using something, and it's free. And so that kind of leads into composting. So I really think composting is a great thing to do. It gets you free compost, which is great because compost is expensive. It also means that you get to put food waste that you would have in your home into your compost, so you reduce the amount going to landfill, and that reduces the effects that food waste can have in landfill sites by producing methane and contributing to climate change. But obviously I do understand not everyone would have room for a compost because of obviously space. If you've got a really small space, if you've just got a balcony, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So if you're going to buy it, just make sure you buy peat free, because peat extraction is really awful for the environment. Peat bogs are drained in order to extract the peat, which destroys them, and they're really important habitats and they're really important carbon stores. And then just avoid chemical pesticides, which are really bad for the local wildlife and the local environment. And there's other things you can do. So you can put sort of potting grit or eggshells around the base of plants, which things like slugs don't like crawling over. So that's a great way of deterring them. But then you can also, if you really struggle with pests, use things like biological pest control, such as nematodes. That's a good option. And then, so making sure that if you buy any wooden furniture for the garden or any sort of wooden planters, making sure that the wood is FSC accredited or an equivalent if that's not available where you live, just to make sure that the wood that it's come from has been sustainably grown and harvested. And then just maximize permeable surfaces. So that basically means have surfaces that allows the water to drain through. And this is particularly important in urban areas where you get a lot of runoff and it can contribute to flash flooding. So have things like gravel, slate, bare ground, as opposed to solid surfaces. Okay, and then so for wildlife friendly gardening tips, things like putting up bird boxes and having bird feeders can make a really big difference. So have bird boxes in the spring, particularly for nesting, and then bird feeders in the winter to make sure that birds have enough food over the winter. That's a really great thing to do. You can have insect hotels, or which are like little boxes with like holes in for insects. And you can also leave piles of like wood, so logs or whatever, in one corner of your garden. And they're really useful for insects to hibernate in over winter as well. So just make sure you don't move them in that time. And then focus on things like planting native wildflowers. These really support the local ecosystem, and try and plant in all available spaces. So, if you've got a small area, try and use vertical space as well, use climbing plants. And if you've got a big enough area, you can try and leave an area where the grass can grow long and you don't need to weed this area. And that's really beneficial to wildlife. And if you've got the space as well, having a pond is a really, really great thing to do. That's really great. You attract things like frogs and really important species. Okay, so just a quick note on native plants. As I said, they're important to have in your garden, and they basically support the local ecosystem, the local species, and that contributes to the ecosystem services in your area. So native species support the local carbon cycle and water regulation, but they're really important, particularly for pollinator species. So native plant species will support your native pollinator species, which then helps with crop production and food production in your area. So it's really helpful for us, and also just really great for the environment. So the species will really differ depending on where you live. So I haven't included any examples because the ones that I would have will be really different to what a lot of you will all have. But just do some research, find out what's native in your area, and try and include some of those species in your garden. So I just wanted to include some tips for sort of urban gardening, because I think gardening in small spaces can be quite challenging, but I also think it's really worth it. So you can make use of lots of spaces, so you can get a bit creative with this. So you can use vertical space by using things like vertical planters. So in the bottom right-hand corner here, there's a picture of some apple crates that I've turned into a little vegetable garden. So it's a little vertical vegetable garden. And that worked really well last year. You can also have things like plant shelves, which is like the top right-hand corner. So, you know, you can have shelves with pots on. And then you can also use things like trellises with the climbers. There was a picture of that earlier. And then, so just sometimes in urban gardens, it's easier to make use of lots of containers. So you can use them on patios, you can use them on balconies, you can use them on windowsills. And you can even grow vegetables in a lot of containers. You get actually different varieties of certain vegetables. So things like carrots, you can get container specific carrots, and basically they're designed to grow, or they've been bred to grow a bit shorter so that they grow well in containers. So you can just do a bit of research into that. And then try and focus on perennial flowers and decorative plants so that you don't need to grow as much from seed. So perennial flowers basically means they come back every year. So if you've got your flowers in your garden that do that, then the space that you have to grow seeds, you can use for things like vegetables, and you're not, you know, competing for space. And then just try and plan your space and your planting schedule for the year. So try planting, having a planting schedule where you can grow different types of vegetables, say, throughout the year, so that you've always got something there that you can grow to eat, because different plants grow at different times in the year, and you harvest them at different times in the year. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight that gardening is a really great opportunity to reuse materials. So say supermarket, the plastic trays or the tubs that you get vegetables in, like mushrooms, you can actually use those for seedling trays, so for growing on seedlings before you plant them out. You can cut sort of empty bottles. Obviously we avoid plastic and single-use plastic, but you know, if you're buying a fizzy drink in a bottle and you've got the bottles, you can cut them in half, and you can use those cut in half bottles as covers for seedlings as they're growing, as the picture in the top is showing. And you can kind of get creative with repurposed containers. So I said I've used apple crates, you can use ceramic sinks, you can even grow plants in old boots. Just make sure that the container's big enough for the plant that you're trying to grow in it, and also that it's got some drainage. And then I really recommend taking cuttings and growing new plants from cuttings. This is a great way of A, getting free plants, and B, you know, buying less plants that haven't been shipped in. So it's a better way of getting more plants is using cuttings. So basically that table there has got loads of different cuttings on, and you basically take cuttings from a plant, you put it into soil or into water and wait for it to start growing new roots, and then you can plant that on, and you know, you've got more plants. And then finally, I really recommend harvesting seeds, particularly if you do plant wildflowers in your garden. Most of them will go to seed in the autumn. So all you need to do is shake out the seeds from the seed heads, keep them somewhere warm to dry out, and then just store them in like an envelope until the next year, and you can plant them again. And then, you know, you just have a continual supply of wildflowers without having to buy new seeds every time. So that's a really great thing to do as well. So these are just my sources. So I'll just stop sharing my screen, and then you can ask me any questions if you have any. Sorry, I rattled through that because I was stressed about the time.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I feel like I learned so much already from you. One of the questions I had was, when did you start gardening?
So I've actually been gardening since I was quite young. So I used to garden with my mum when I lived at home. And they actually they live in the countryside, they have quite a big garden. So that was like a different experience of gardening. And then I've been gardening in my own garden for just under 2 years now, since I've been living where I live now. And that's like quite a small urban garden. So it's like a completely different style of gardening, because at home with my parents, like it was just, there was enough space, you could just try anything and like have loads of plants, whereas I have to be a bit more sort of, you know, concise and think about what plants I want to make sure I've got the space to grow them, particularly with vegetables. It's a bit of a different thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, is there a chat? Let me see. Saving seeds for the next year. Yeah, so if you save seeds from tomatoes or other vegetables, they don't always work. Yeah, so part of the problem with that might be that sometimes if they're from vegetables you bought in a shop, sometimes the vegetables they're like sterile, because they've been bred to produce big fruits, so the seeds might not actually be that good at sort of growing again if you replant them. So you might not have the best success with that. Things like wildflowers, because they're pretty much in their natural form, they've not been cultivated really. They're much easier to grow back from seed. But that being said, you can grow vegetables from seed, so do try it. You just might not get that many, if that makes sense. I've had like really mixed success with that, particularly like chilies. But yeah, making sure they dry out first is super important, because otherwise they won't germinate. And well, so if you are planting them and you don't have cold weather, you can try sticking them in the freezer for like a week or so first, and then planting them, because it just like forces them to start germinating.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah, can I just ask a question about generally, do you have a favorite thing that you like to plan? And I know you said that now you have to be a little bit more organized with what you plan. Do you have one consistent thing that you just always go to?
Yeah, so for vegetables, I think things like radishes are really easy. They're dead easy. They come up really quick as well, so you can just plant them and use them and plant more. They literally start sprouting within like a couple of days of planting. But things like herbs, I think, are really, really useful to have, because they're something that I think I would waste a lot if I buy them, because you buy them in like as cut herbs and they like go off and you throw them away. So that's a big food waste element for me. So I like growing herbs, because then I don't need to buy them, and then I just cut them and there's no waste, if that makes sense. So, like basil, thyme, whatever.
All right, I'm gonna go next with another question. What would you say was your favorite like planting system to build? Like, which one of the ones, like I know you've used a lot of reusable materials to make your planting system, is your favorite?
So the apple crates have worked really well. I think they're fun. They were a fun thing to make as well. They're really great because I actually don't have any sort of area to plant vegetables in my garden. I've just got like one flower bed, but it's not really suitable for planting vegetables in. So I think that one's been my favorite. I actually used to have an old sink that I'd planted alpines in. That worked quite well. But yeah, I think the apple crates have probably been my favorite one. And you can get those quite cheaply as well. It's way cheaper than buying a planter would be.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions before we move on to the next speaker? Okay, if not, thank you so much. And the next speaker can start.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I believe I'm next. My name is Marie Wilson, and I go by Mindful Peaks on Instagram and as well as my blog. And I work as a freelance writer and a climate activist, and a majority of the work I do and the writing that I do is focused around that intersectionality of the climate crisis and the outdoor industry. So today I'm coming from you from Washington State, so other side of the country. And I am someone who has been involved within the outdoor industry for a lot of my life, which is really kind of what sparked me on getting into this. So today I'm going to kind of talk about sustainability in the outdoors, kind of what that entails, what actions we can take to minimize our impact, as well as the difference between individual and collective action, both in the outdoors and just in sustainability in general. So like I said, yeah, I'm someone who thankfully was fortunate enough to be involved in the outdoors for as long as I can remember, and mostly like hiking and skiing, and the area where I live is very mountainous. So spending a lot of time in the forest, in the mountains, and kind of took that for granted, and it was just a certain part of my life. And it wasn't probably until I'd say like 7 years ago or 8 years ago when I went off to college or university that I got more involved in sustainability and started realizing that there's a really big disconnect between the sustainability movement and the outdoor industry. And one of the reasons that is because it's very easy to equate something that is outdoorsy to sustainable. So when we see an outdoor brand and all of their advertisements are like people hiking in the mountains, we often just assume that, of course, that they would operate in a way that would protect those wild spaces, which unfortunately that isn't the case for a lot of the outdoor industry. So like I said, the industry itself is susceptible to all of the unsustainable practices that are in other parts of, society as a whole. So whether that is overconsumption or mass production or unethical and unsustainable practices like fast fashion, are all embedded within the outdoor industry as well. And so when we talk about sustainability in the outdoors, I kind of like to break it down into like three main groups, because obviously sustainability in any industry, there are so many different facets. But when it comes to the outdoors, really I talk about gear a lot, the food that we're consuming, and transportation. So when we talk about gear, people often don't necessarily think that outdoor brands are having those same practices that, like I said, the fast fashion industry is having. So I tell people, if they ask what's the most sustainable gear that we can have, that the most sustainable gear or brand is using what we already own, which is perhaps maybe an unexciting answer. But we are often led to think that we constantly need new gear and like the latest jacket and the latest boots and this and backpack and all of these things in order to be more sustainable, when the most sustainable action we can do is taking care of that gear we already own and making it last for as long as possible. So this looks like, repairing any rips or tears as soon as they like arise. Sometimes we leave them to just keep getting bigger, and then at that point it becomes usually too large of an issue that we can repair. So they're past the point of keeping them for a long time. Another way that we can make our gear more sustainable is really diving into the sustainable claims that a lot of outdoor brands are making. So most websites, whether it be a brand in the outdoors or not, is going to have some sort of like sustainability section these days. But that doesn't mean that that brand is truly as sustainable and ethical as they say. So kind of looking into the claims that they're making, seeing if they're making really broad, vague claims, or if they have like really tangible goals and maybe third-party certificates or third-party studies that are showing that they are living up to these, claims that they're making. Another way to make our gear more sustainable is really looking into not just how the item was produced, but also what it is being produced by. So a lot of outdoor gear is made from synthetic materials, which a lot of those derive from oil. So how can we make this gear, if we need it to be waterproof, because sometimes we do need those materials, how can we make that more sustainable? Does it come down to repurposing old gear? I know that some brands are doing that, and kind of, repurposing that material. Or what are they doing to combat, the dyeing process of certain items? Is there a lot of water runoff from that? Is it polluting water for local communities? So really diving into kind of the process from the conception to the packaging to when it's in the consumer's hands. What are brands doing to ensure that this gear is sustainable? And besides gear, I also said food. So it's really easy and convenient to just have packaged food when we are out and about on hikes or bike rides or trail run, whatever it is we're doing. And one of the simplest things we can do is to try and make our own food. And it obviously requires a little more time and forethought. And I'm not someone who is completely zero waste. I never want to put the pressure on people to be like the quote perfect environmentalist. but it is about, being conscious of our actions, trying to maybe just bring more of our own food and cut back on the amount of packaged food. And the same goes for trying to eat as local and as seasonal as possible. So, really planning ahead on what we're bringing. And as someone who lives in the Pacific Northwest, we don't have tropical fruits here. So, cutting back on those items that I'm bringing and trying to bring more local things like apples or other, local grown greenhouses that are maybe growing some of those more exciting fruits and vegetables. And the third way that we can make that outdoor industry more sustainable comes down to transportation. So it's really easy to just think, oh, I can just, easily drive to a trailhead or something like that. And if that is accessible to us, it's about being conscious of those actions and seeing if maybe we can carpool with people. One, it's always fun to go with more people when we go on these outdoor adventures, but it's also going to be better for the environment if we can try and carpool and get more people to go. Maybe I know in some parts of the country or the world, even having like public transit that leads towards green spaces, whether that is, a state park or a national park, or even just, a local park in your city, or biking if that is an option for you as well. So while these actions truly matter and our actions on the trail matter, like not littering or staying on the path and not treading on like the fragile ecosystems, it really comes down to our actions off the trail have a much larger impact on just sustainability and the outdoors, and understanding that everything from whether it be the outdoor gear we're buying or just our everyday clothes that we're wearing or the food that we're buying or how much plastic we're consuming, all of these actions that we're taking when we're at home or at school or just not in the outdoors have a really large impact on protecting these wild spaces that we really enjoy exploring. So when it comes to individual and systemic actions, it's really easy when we talk about sustainability for a lot of people's mind to just go to individual actions. So that is, people talk about going vegan or cutting back on our meat and dairy consumption. They talk about going zero waste or trying to limit the amount of plastic we have. And while these actions are immensely important and something that we should all strive for or just trying to improve on and challenge ourselves, there's something that we do on a daily basis, and it's a very personal level for a lot of us. We might talk to friends and family about it, but it's not something necessarily on like a systemic level that we are doing. So those actions are really focusing on lowering our personal carbon footprint. And oftentimes that's a great way to do that, but it's not the best way that we can create systemic changes. So one kind of issue that some people have with these individual actions is that they are not accessible for everyone. So like I said, the area that I live in, the United States, is very eco-friendly forward, and there are zero waste shops and plenty of vegan options, and just make it really easy for someone to have those options to make changes. But we must understand when we talk about individual actions that a lot of these choices that we're making are an immense privilege that a lot of people across the country or across the world as a whole don't have access to. So yes, we should challenge ourselves, but we also need to be working as a collective to make these options more accessible to a wider range of people. So when we talk about collective action, that is what really implements like systemic changes. So that can look like contacting our local representatives, emailing them on how they're voting on a bill or what their stance is on what they're running for. That looks like signing petitions, like I said, voting if that is an option, or protesting and encouraging other people to vote if we ourselves aren't eligible. Looks like writing to companies, kind of like I was saying, to those outdoor brands, really pressing them on the sustainable claims that they're making and trying to push for more transparency. And when just one person does one of these collective actions, it can seem like just a simple thing. If I'm the only person who ever writes to my local representative, they might ignore the email and never even think twice about it. But if we do it as a community, as a state, as a country, or on a global scale, and hundreds or thousands or millions of people are taking these actions, that is when we create a movement and when systemic changes truly happen. That's when laws are passed, that's when treaties are signed, that's when we have, like yesterday, a virtual climate summit for a lot of the major countries. And we are really just pushing for, those strong goals to be set. So that is something that when we are able to do both individual and collective actions, that is when true change happens. So I often say that, like I said, the perfect environmentalist doesn't exist. And I'm all for taking individual actions, and I do my part to try and, be as sustainable as possible in my daily life. But it also comes down to acknowledging the fact that individual actions alone aren't going to combat the climate crisis, and neither are systemic changes. If we had all the systemic changes in the world, but everyone is still consuming, and just going about their lives in the current way that they are, then we're never going to combat the climate crisis. So it's about intertwining those two and making all of these options much more accessible to more people. So when it comes to kind of connecting the two of sustainability in the outdoors and individual and collective actions, so like I said, individual actions within the outdoors looks like making our gear last for as long as possible. It looks like trying to make our own food and minimizing our waste. It looks like carpooling to trailheads, things that are very tangible that most people might be trying to do already. But when we talk about collective action within the outdoor industry, that can look like writing to these outdoor brands, asking them what they're doing to be more sustainable and more ethical, how they're trying to combat the negative effects of the products that they're using or the materials, voting for bills and representatives who are really prioritizing climate action, attending protests surrounding climate change, um, like I said, holding those companies accountable for the claims they're making, and making the outdoors more accessible. Because I know for myself and for so many others within the outdoor industry, spending time in the outdoors can be a really crucial aspect of what inspires people and motivates them to just get more involved. And so when we try and make the outdoors more accessible, we're trying to break down those barriers and get more people involved in these outdoor spaces. And that just results in, one, more people getting to enjoy this public land, and also gets more people involved in climate action, brings it a little closer to home for a lot of people, and ultimately, creates more change fighting against the climate crisis. That is all I had to say today, but does anyone have any questions?
Hi, that was so great. And I really like some of the points that you were making about how things are made and things like this. And I think that it's a really important topic. Do you have any tips on when you're talking to people, how you would bring that up? And because I feel like it's a very daunting topic and something that a lot of people know, but just don't really know what to do with it. So, in your experience, what's been an effective way of communicating it?
Yeah, in terms of like fast fashion and like trying to kind of break that down. Yeah, I think it can be a very daunting topic. And one that if we're passionate about, it is hard to approach it in like a really positive way, because we're like, I just want everyone to like make all these changes. I know it can be very easy to just like get heated pretty easily. So, I mean, I would just say my first recommendation is I usually recommend like a documentary or a book, be like, oh, I found this like really interesting and it really like changed my perspective on this issue. I've realized in all aspects of sustainability over the past like 10 years that people respond and are much more likely to change or just be open-minded if we kind of, like I said, meet them where they're at and just kind of impart our knowledge or any experience or anything that helped us. So if it was a specific documentary, like The True Cost is a really good one in terms of fast fashion. I just kind of recommend that to people rather than trying to like tackle the entire issue on my own. That way they can, watch it on their own, make their own interpretation, and then just being there to help them along the way for whatever changes they're making. Like I said, meeting them where they're at, and offering any tips that like helped you, just showing that you're like there to support them rather than shaming them for, taking actions that they might not even know are unsustainable or unethical.
I have a question. So how did you discover these sort of issues that I feel like a lot of people don't know about, like with the gear and other issues like that?
Yeah. So like I said, it wasn't until I went to like college, I went to school in Portland, Oregon, which if you're from the States, you probably know Portland, Oregon. And it was just a very like progressive environment that I was in that was really focused. The community I was in was really focused on sustainability. That was kind of like my gateway into a lot of these issues. And I was really involved in whether it was like low waste living or sustainable fashion just when I was in college, but I didn't really make the connection until a few years later when I think maybe I was like purchasing new gear and the idea kind of clicked that I was purchasing something that was still made of material and that was still being produced and made by individuals. And so it was really just making that connection that the fashion industry extends so much farther than just what most people think of fashion. It's everything from our outdoor gear to the bed sheets we have to our towels. All of these things that are made from fabric kind of fall under that umbrella. And so it was really just, opening my eyes to what the fashion industry entails, and understanding that, like I said, I was probably subject, like most people are, that just because something was outdoorsy doesn't equate to sustainability. So kind of putting that critical lens on all aspects of the outdoor industry to see ways that there was room for improvement.
Okay, so I know a lot of like apps for reselling, like reselling old clothes and reselling old items are becoming very popular right now. Do you use any of those? And if so, which ones do you recommend for like increasing your sustainability and buying used clothes as opposed to new ones?
Yeah, there's definitely, I know I've bought gear, I think on, I want to say Depop, and I'm completely blanking on other on other apps. A lot of the used gear I find is not so much usually on apps, but I think ThreadUp I found gear as well. But other ones, so places like REI and Patagonia and the North Face all have their own websites for used gear. So it's, I think, REI Good and Used. Is it? And if you just search Patagonia used gear, it'll like show up. Same with the North Face. Which is really helpful because I try not to buy new gear at all. Or if I do, I try and really limit it. I usually purchase from Patagonia because they're kind of at the forefront for making sustainable and ethical gear. But at the same time, when we can buy used from those companies, I'm all for it. So that's really good because they kind of have like quality reassurance, knowing that the used item that you're buying is, safe, and because sometimes we need that safety feature in our gear. So yeah, I would say even just searching like major outdoor brands and used, almost all like major outdoor brands now kind of have their own website for used gear, which is really helpful because you can get high quality gear, but the price point is a lot cheaper, making it much more accessible to a lot of people.
I have a quick question. How did you do you think there's still a challenge about how outdoor brands are addressing the explorer image? Like when you look into Google, like and you look explorer or someone who is hiking, you always see white people.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think there's still a challenge in that, or is still like I don't know, like a marketing strategy, or brands are already addressing it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that there is still a massive issue within the outdoor industry, whether in terms of, just portraying what the stereotypical explorer or who we see in advertising is often who we may subconsciously equate to being like, oh, I have never seen someone like myself out exploring on an advertisement. So, that's just another barrier that people of color are going to face in the outdoors. I have seen, thankfully, in the past year, some brands taking some action. I know both REI and Hoka and Patagonia have all taken some actions in the past years, but does seem from the outside, obviously I'm not working directly with those brands, to be more surface level. And it is just understanding that the outdoor industry, like any industry here in the States especially, is so deeply embedded with much deeper issues like white privilege. And it is definitely not free of those things, which I definitely will say when I say, the outdoors is embedded with privilege, is when I get like a lot of pushback, but it most certainly is. I mean, I recognize the fact that I grew up in a middle-class family and am white, and that is most people who are within the outdoor industry. So really trying to get involved in like local community groups. I know there are ones in like my city that try and get lower income families and kids just involved in the outdoors so they can learn, because it really is just like making it more accessible. And I think it does come down to making our gear more accessible, because the price point for so much gear is so high that it's just a huge barrier for people getting involved. So like seeing major outdoor brands repurposing their used gear so that people can still get that high quality gear, but it's not hundreds of dollars for a ski jacket, and making it more accessible. Yeah. Any other questions? I think my time is almost up here. So if not, thanks for having me, everyone. And I will pass it over to the host or the next speaker. I'm not sure.
Yes, the next speaker can get started. Thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me?
We're good.
All right, awesome. I have a spotty Wi-Fi connection where I am, so just let me know if I ever cut in or cut out, and I will pause and get it started again. But hi, everyone. I have a presentation that I'm going to pull up, so I'm going to share my screen for you all so you can see that. All right, here we go. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Ngozi Chukwueke. I am so happy to be here with you all today, just talking about two things that are really, really important to me: sustainability and community care. So during this presentation, I'm going to go into a few different things. So first, we're going to talk about my story, who I am as a person, and how I got to where I am today. Something called systems thinking. Some of you may be familiar with the concept, some might not. So we're going to explore that and chat about that a little bit. Bioregionalism, which is actually a new idea to me that I'm really excited to talk about with you all. And then lastly, community care. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about me. So I am an AmeriCorps Civic Spark Fellow, currently serving with the City of Santa Monica, and I work in the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. This picture here on the left is actually us at our first in-person service day. So that was so cool because coming into the pandemic, starting this fellowship, I personally thought that I was never going to meet any of my other fellows. I was really upset that my experience during my fellowship wasn't going to be quite what I thought it was. So it was really cool to have this service day. But I think my experiences leading up to this are even more important than just this one picture, right? Because a picture can only tell you so much. So I started out when I was younger, very, very entrepreneurial, very excited about life, very much so into exploring and picking up new ideas and trying new things. So I've always been a super, super adventurous kid. And when I was younger, I loved reading as well. So my favorite books were The Babysitter's Club. If anyone's familiar with that, they made an amazing Netflix adaptation recently, and I absolutely loved it. And then Kid Power as well. And those are two of my favorite books because they just focused on this entrepreneurial spirit. These kids, these girls that were go-getters, right? And that could really do anything that they set their minds to. And that was so important to me as a young Black woman, just growing up and hearing from people, even writing, just like seeing that, hey, I can go out, I can have an idea, I can do something, I can accomplish this. And reading was really my gateway to all of that. So I was maybe in 5th or 6th grade, right? And I'm laughing because this is such a funny story looking back at it. But I had the idea in my head that I was going to be the next Bill Gates. I was like, you know what? I've read all these different books. I'm sure I know how to be an entrepreneur. So I'm going to head out and do this thing, right? So I literally walk out on faith, and I'm making my little decorated flyers for my odd job business that I had planned to launch. And I am about to walk out the door and literally put them up in my neighborhood. And my parents are like, hey, like, wait, we know that you're super into this idea of going out and starting your own business, but how do you feel about maybe community service? And so they sat down with me and they had this talk about what it looked like to maybe serve my community instead of make profit off my community, which at my age, I was like, oh man, like they don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to be rich, right? But looking back, I'm really, really thankful for that, because that's exactly the type of thinking that got me to where I am today. So after that, just heading into my education, like in college. So I was a management and marketing double major, social work minor. And even right now, working in this AmeriCorps fellowship, and also working with Brown Grow Green on the side as a brand content intern, and getting to create a lot of eco-friendly content for everyone has been so interesting, because I'm now able to really engage with people and focus on more than just a bottom line, focus on more than just sales and salary and all of these things that are really, really common when you head into the corporate world. So I'm really pleased that I did get to make that transition, and I'm now in a space where I get to learn about the community and how the environment affects them, and all these different things and aspects that are so much more important than just the idea of making profit or making sure that a big project is a success. So the first question that I want to ask, what is systems thinking? If anyone's familiar with systems thinking, you can drop it in the chat box, tell me what you think that is, or maybe even unmute yourself and let me know if you know what systems thinking is, because this is something that I found out a few months ago, and I've been doing a lot of research into it and a lot of thinking about it, and really internalizing it within myself and learning to think about what that means in my course of work every day. I don't think I can see the chat box. I just realized. So if anyone has any thoughts, just feel free to unmute yourself whenever. So these are two graphics that are from Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram, designed by Aaron Shea. And I absolutely love these. Intersectional Environmentalist is an amazing Instagram account. If anyone's not following them, you should, because they teach me something every single day. And I absolutely loved how this graphic displayed ecosystem thinking or systems thinking. So as you can all see, systems thinking acknowledges that everything on Earth is intimately connected, right? And that innate vitality and intelligence is amplified when we actually look at things and recognize that things are in relationship with each other. I found that so often when you work in sustainability and you work in environmentalism, there are so many people that approach the situation as, okay, it's me versus the environment, it's me versus the earth. But one of the most important things to me when I was really diving into the space, because a year ago, I didn't know anything about environmentalism, and now I work in something that deals with environmentalism every day, and it's very, very central to it. It's the most important thing to me to understand that we're not separate from the environment, right? We are the environment. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think that the environment is something that we have to fix. It's something that we have to protect. But then when you say protect, you don't include the people in that. And I've always thought that that was really odd, especially coming from my background of wanting to do a lot of community service, a lot of social impact work, that how can we protect something as big and as beautiful as the earth and not think about the people that are on the earth? So ecosystem thinking really acknowledges and respects all the unique benefits, differences, and limits of all life forms on Earth. So we're talking about plants, people, animals, everything. So we have the diversity on the globe, which is like literally everything that you can think of living here. And then you also have that aspect of, okay, so how do we function within all these systems together? So one of the projects that I'm working on right now in my role for the city of Santa Monica is for a food systems plan for our entire city. So in that, it's been really interesting, right? Because I do a lot of talking about, okay, well, here's our food system, right? we're not necessarily a food desert, we're not a food swamp, we're more of a food mirage because Santa Monica is super duper tiny if you've ever been to the area or if you've heard about it. It's only about 8.3 square miles. So it's important to understand that system, right? And to understand that, hey, our food system doesn't necessarily look like everyone else's system, but let's see how it interacts with our system surrounding race, right? Race and ethnicity. So we have some lower income communities of color within our community, right? And so when you think about those two things and you start seeing how they intersect, you're like, okay, well, maybe this isn't a food desert, but now that I know that there are some racial components here or some ethnicity focused components here, I can say that, okay, these two things intersect in a way that I didn't see initially. And now that I understand how these two systems are functioning within the society, within the city, I can now take on the proper approach, or I don't even want to say the proper approach because there's so many different ways to approach a problem, and we'll get into that later. But once you understand what systems you function within and how things overlap and intersect, things get so much more interesting. It no longer becomes a black and white situation, no longer from point A to point B. And we see that with systems thinking because it forms more of a web and less of a linear solution. So our next big idea that I want to touch on is called bioregionalism. So bioregionalism is a term that I picked up a month or so ago, and it was while I was doing a training for a resilience hub in my community that we're trying to build and implement. So with this, we talk about resilient spaces, right? And if anyone's familiar with community resilience strategies when it comes to sustainability, you look a lot about like this idea of community care, but then also injecting sustainability into it and asking yourself, okay, well, what does that really look like to have a resilient community? Because we want sustainability to be a part of everything, right? But so often people leave out what the community needs, what the community wants, and what the community's goals are. So bioregionalism is this really full philosophical movement and understanding school of thought that accounts for natural characteristics that are found in a place or space. So it's about like going outside and not just noticing the built environment, but really the birds, the bees, the air, literally everything about the earth around you, and not just the things that we as humans have come into a space and created. It's really comprehensive, and it's how we understand the world minus the built environment, basically. So I've always thought that this is really interesting because I personally am a city girl. I live in Los Angeles, and I think it's crazy that we've built up these entire cities, these skyscrapers, yet we haven't really thought about what the earth looked like before it, right? We're so used to existing where we are, we don't really take enough time to look at what was here before. So me, for instance, I'm calling in from LA on Chumash land, and our native caretakers of the land who existed then, still exist now, will exist in the future. They're not people of the past, right? They've done such an amazing job at taking this idea of bioregionalism and making this a lifestyle, right? And then here we come with all the extra and all the things that we've made common to us nowadays, and we've kind of lost our way when it comes to bioregionalism. So all in all, it's really mindful of the local environment, the history, and what the community needs and wants. So I want to pose a question to everyone, just a little thing to get your mind kind of working. And it's something that I ask myself a lot and have in the last year when all of these crazy, crazy things have been happening and still are happening. How does my sustainability support the people around me? So this is such an important question because a lot of times we talk about sustainability and we don't make it personal, right? We say, okay, well, this needs to happen so the earth can do this, or that needs to happen, these emissions need to be cut. But how does your sustainability support the people directly around you? I'm a very huge proponent of mutual aid. If anyone's familiar with pod mapping, it's the idea that if you take stock of the people that you know in the community, the people that you can really reach out to, you can actually kind of like reach out your arms left to right and say, okay, I know this person on my left side that's good with maybe food security, they're good with cooking or resilient strategies when it comes to feeding the community. And this person is really good when it comes to environmentalism, gardening, all of these things. And pod mapping is that idea of kind of bringing these people close together and coming together with your own skills and talents and saying, hey, all of us have these things, so what can we do for the people around us with them? And then I like to go even further and add the sustainability level. So how can we make this sustainable, not just for the environment, but also for our community? And once you add in that layer of making things sustainable for the community, that's when you build a resilient community. That's when you build a community that can bounce back from disasters, right? So things like Hurricane Katrina, all these heat waves that come through in the summer, when the power goes out, all of these little things that seem small at the moment in the news cycle that kind of come and go, those are real things that impact people's lives. And it's so important that we're building resilient communities and constantly asking people and taking stock of what people need so we can be sustainable in more ways than just one. So this is one of my favorite examples of community resilience right here in LA. So these are LA's community fridges, and LA County is absolutely huge, right? Only, I think, a few states in the US are bigger than LA County, maybe like 6 or 8 or something. So if that gives you like any idea of like how big it is. So these are community fridges essentially, and it's pretty easy to see that there is free food available in these to the community. Anyone can come by and get food. There's no gatekeeping, no restrictions on how much you can take or what you can take. And all of this is just done in good faith and community trust and community support, which I absolutely love. And not only is it done with good community faith, it's actually done in the spirit of sustainability as well. Because when we talk about food waste, food security, all of these things, right? These community fridges help prevent that. So if people ever have surplus, if they have things that they know they're not going to finish, if you've ever bought too many things, you're able to go to these community fridges and just put it in there for other community members to take. And it doesn't even have to be this formal either. Another form of this, I lived in dorms a lot of the time in college, and a lot of times people would just leave food on the table that they weren't eating. So it didn't go to waste. And so that other people that were in need, if you want to call it that, in need in our dormitory, were able to benefit from the surplus of other people. So this is just a really formal way that it's displayed, and a really formal way that we see sustainability coming to life with all these different projects. But it doesn't even have to be as difficult as that, right? It can be an everyday exchange from neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, which I really love. So this is my closing question that I want to ask everyone. How do we prioritize the planet while protecting the people? So thinking about systems thinking and bioregionalism and this big idea of community care, it's so important that we allow all of these to intersect and interact with each other, because if not, we go back to these ideas, this big system of structural racism and inequity and inequality, and we find ourselves kind of functioning within those bubbles without ever taking the time to cross over. So especially when we talk about the planet, we talk about the earth, I want us to all remember that we are people on the planet. We are a part of the earth. We are the environment. And so it's so important as we look at the ways that our sustainability practices affect others around us, and not just ourselves and not just the planet either, that we really protect the people around us and form inclusive spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of colors in our communities. And just really think about the people as much as we think about our planets as well when we approach sustainability. So that's all I have for you all with my presentation. And I would love to take questions if you'd like.
I was just going to ask, how would you encourage people to start participating with the smaller parts of their environment more, like you were mentioning, like the bees and the plants and the grass? Like, how would you encourage people to start like working with those parts more?
Mm-hmm. So my thing that I always say with that is number one step is just getting outside, right? So I think that so many people learned during COVID that our relationship with the environment is very much so broken, right? Even I learned that this past year, I guess it's been a year, I've really just been indoors, right? Just chilling, just watching the days go by, all the days have blurred together. And one of the most important things to me has been really reteaching myself to go outside, enjoy the earth, actually see what it has to offer, and learn to be present and mindful in the moment. And once you start interacting with the earth in a different way and stop seeing the earth as something that we just use or something that's just there, something that we just live on, you know, it's not just this big like space rock floating in the sky. Once you start seeing it as that and you start interacting with things in a way that's really like pure and mindful, I would say that's the best way to start interacting with these things. And then as you start like doing that, you'll start finding people naturally that also interact with the earth in that way. And that's how these like natural communities form. So I would say that's some advice for you all.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions before we move on to the next speaker?
I have a quick one. I was just going to say, you said like we've sort of lost that sort of bioregional perspective. There's been like a more traditional sort of way of managing the land that indigenous people have been very good at doing. Do you think that sort of that loss of that is pretty much reflected in the sort of massive white saviorism perspective that we've had in sort of environmentalism traditionally? Because obviously it's been sustainability has been very sort of dominated, like everything else has been, with sort of mainly white people sort of feeling like they need to save people or like do something different. And do you think that's sort of deliberately stepped over those sort of more traditional sort of bioregional perspectives because people have that systemic racism has really impacted there? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. That was a really badly phrased question, but
no, you are absolutely fine. I totally get you. But yeah, I do think that is a large part of it. So you talked about how like all of these things are built on these structures of racism, right? Like we both mentioned that just now, and it's absolutely true, right? So a lot of times people will say that history is written by the victors, quote unquote, the victors, right? Or the oppressors, some would say. And of course, everything that happens in history follows what the victors want it to look like, right? So if we have people that are coming in and taking and conquering land and really doing what they please with it, that's exactly what happens afterwards. You know, people don't have the space to advocate for land use in the way that's traditional to them, in the way that's correct to them. So I would say that that's exactly right. Like that is one of the really big factors that comes into how we treat land now and what perspectives have taken over when it comes to how we view the use of the land. And it's a constant unlearning process because I'm still unlearning and I learn every single day, right? This is never going to be like a straight hike to the top. Like I've learned everything I can learn, but I'm having a really good time just learning right now and internalizing all of that and unlearning at the same time, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right in saying that because it does play a really big role in how we view the land now.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks.
I have a quick question. I was wondering, how do you find a balance when you talk about bioregionalism and when you talk about, for example, the example that you put about the fridges that say comida gratis, like how, like all these things, all these actions, like doesn't feel like, well, I say it because it happens to me sometimes. How do you find that balance for not feeling it so overwhelming in the long run? So how, I don't know. What do you think about it?
Are you asking about, I just want to understand your question. So are you asking like how I deal with the anxiety of like knowing what all is going on with the earth? I want to make sure I understand your question correctly.
Oh, so I was saying that basically I see that you do plenty of things, like you do things like that are very local, but you also have like system thinking and exactly like how do you manage with all that action that you want to do everything at all time, you know? It's like collective and individual, local and systemic, like how do you deal with everything?
Yeah, no, that's a super good question. And I'm still learning how to deal with everything, right? It's so wild, just like kind of like stepping back and saying, like, oh my gosh, like this is a really huge system, like this world that we're in right now. But the way that I deal with it is trying to do what I can, right? So first, you have to start with yourself because that's always the best way to start. And you can't really control anyone else's actions but yourself, no matter our best efforts, right? But then going from just myself and saying, okay, who can I touch in my community when I take this action? So going back to that concept of pod mapping that I mentioned. So taking stock of who you know, who's in your community, and what your community's needs are. If you just take small steps like that, so taking stock of, for instance, things like, okay, there's a lot of garbage in my community, and sanitation infrastructure go hand in hand, right? And that plays into a larger system, right? Especially when it comes to like government infrastructure and these things, and seeing like how, basically looking at how like our communities function on a larger scale compared to like other communities and other zip codes, right? So even this issue such as like sanitation can become something that is so much bigger and really affects people down the line. So I personally try to make it personal to myself first, and then I make it personal to my community and what my community needs. And then as more people start to do that, as we start to kind of build out those systems, that's how we connect those things, and we all end up doing what's best for our own little bioregions and our own respective systems.
Okay, thank you so much. And we will move on to the next speaker.
Well, thank you.
I'm the next one, right?
Yes.
Okay, I will share my screen. Okay, let me just fix this. Okay, so my name is Miriam Castillo. I'm from Mexico, and today I'm going to be talking about environmental racism in Latin America. I am not going to tell my whole story because it is, I mean, I don't think it's right to the point now, but basically, I think that we are not addressing enough environmental racism in Latin America, even in the United States and Europe, like intersectionality and the environmental racism issues are being widely talked, but in Latin America, I think that we are not taking into account how huge is this issue here. So what is environmental racism? It is a form of systemic racism whereby communities of color are disproportionately burdened with health hazards through policies and practices. And at the same time, this causes greater rates of health problems by living in proximity to sources of toxic waste, mines, landfills, power stations, major roads, and emitters of airborne particulate matter, right? Air pollution, basically. So this is like the very broad definition, but how do we see it in Latin America? Okay, well, I'm going to, okay. So with a little bit of history, we know that systemic racism in Latin America started during the colonial era after the European conquest in all that we call Latin America. I'm addressing the name America right now until, well, however, I know that America, the whole continent, is agreed to be called by indigenous groups as the Abya Yala. But right now I'm talking as Latin America from Mexico to Chile, right? So this space that we consider Latin America, but it changes like according to what sources we find. The Spanish kingdom had never encountered such variety of races, which races is a social construct, but at the same time, they didn't find like similarities in their appearances with some certain people of certain ethnicities and populations. So they called it races, and in order to preserve white privilege, they structure society in castas, which in English is castes, I think, conditioning all type of resources and rights. So basically, on the right, we have images of how segregated was society in the colonial era. Mexico was at once the new Spain, which was like the center of the Spanish kingdom here in Latin America. So in Mexico, what was the new Spain, we saw these types of divisions depending on who were your parents. You had the access to certain jobs or certain rights or certain types of land, or you were just adjusted to have certain type of life, right? So we have sambos, mulatos, criollos, like many different types of castas that were according to who were your parents. So if you were born here in Mexico and you were raised by Spanish parents, then you have much more privileges than those indigenous people. And of course, the most segregated people was African people that was brought here for slavery. And are we racializing geographical space? Well, by many authors and many academics, Spanish colonialism is a formative of modern racial thinking in Latin America. Like it is a way that we think, like it's a racial which means that we see all those influence all. So in the left side, we have Mexico City, that was once Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire here in Mexico, that after the Spanish people named the capital of the New Spain. And later, because it was a center of power and economics and politics, it became Mexico City as the way we know today. And of course, it has been transformed by technology and many different issues like capitalism and all these new types of urbanization, right? But at the same time, we have certain places and certain structures that are still within that city that were defined during the colonial era. So even right now, like has been like many years, we still have those types of structures within the city because of racism. So the way we configure this is, well, the way we configure space in a systemic way, I like to put it like with these Legos, like we just one over the other and then just like put in more and more and more. Well, this systemic configuration of space is not only about urban areas, it's about recreation spaces, commerce, education spaces, waste management, food harvesting, water extraction and disposal, transport routes, telecommunications, industry, residential areas. So we have all types of spaces within this racial and rational way of thinking based on the privileges of white people, even now. So there are many cases of environmental racism right now in Latin America, but I'm going to expose like some of the ones that are like very widely known, or that have had like previous fights. We have the los pueblos originarios, original pueblos from El Chaco, Argentina. These people has been struggling decades against forestry and mining industries because El Chaco is a very plentiful region for natural resources. So they have been fighting for many long time how they are fighting against this issue. One very popular is the case of indigenous communities in the Amazon, Brazil, which now is very I don't want to say trending because it's not trending. I mean, it's very popular, it's like widely known because of social media and how Jair Bolsonaro has claimed such immense attention with his very debatable ideas. And well, the Amazon communities have fought a lot about forestry and cattle raising industries that right now the current government is giving them access to areas in the rainforests. And this is of course damaging not only wildlife and endemic species, but also indigenous groups that are the protectors of these forests since a very long time. We have the Wimbi community in Ecuador, and these people is an African community that is very segregated in Ecuador. And this small community has been fighting for many years against palm oil industry that is basically displacing them in order to plant more and more palm oil. Also, another type of conflicts that we have in Latin America because of environmental racism is the displacement by armed conflict. It is a very sad case. The people that has been suffered a lot from this is indigenous communities in Colombia and also Afro-Colombianos. They have been fighting a lot for this issue because of the narcos and all the armed and political conflict there has been with drugs and drug commerce. The indigenous people has to have been displaced because most of the drug that has been planted, like marijuana, amapola, like all these plants that are used to produce drugs are harvested in indigenous communities. So because of the armed conflict, they have to be displaced, and they are the most affected communities from this issue, even they are not directly benefiting from it. In Mexico, we can see like example, here in the lab, we have neighbors that saying like no al basurero, no to the landfill, right? This is an illegal landfill that was set in the place called Milpillas, Tetlama. And basically, they are fighting against being surrounded by food and rotten food and trash from the city. So this was like a green space and this was like mountains, but after urbanization, this was settled as a landfill, and people is not okay with that because it's not healthy for sure. And in cities, we also have hostile architecture. It is very sad, but most poor people and people with low education in Mexico is still indigenous people or people with indigenous roots. And it is very sad that because people don't want to see them, like mostly authorities of cities don't want to see them around. They put this type of architecture so they cannot sit, they cannot sleep there, they cannot just lay down on the floor, and they don't have spaces to do anything, right? So it's just, this is just another way to segregate people from spaces because of also like how racism and how race defines your income and your access to resources, even education. And this is also seen in cities with unequal access to green areas in benefit of gentrified zones, because even we say that gentrified areas harm poor people, and yes, of course it's the case, but also in Latin America, it is the case that poor people are also indigenous people or people with indigenous roots. So gentrification also harms indigenous people in the reason that in Mexico City, I'm from Mexico City, that's why I say we. In Mexico City, we have enough green areas for everyone, as United Nations demands or explains, right? But if you see like the map of where are the greenest areas of all the city, you will see that there is no balance. There is disproportion of how these green areas are located. So we have poor areas that have just barely the minimum of green areas, and then we have super big areas with big buildings that have, of course, very big green spaces, right? So this is just another way how we keep segregating people from natural spaces or spaces for recreation that are also beneficial for mental health or health in general. And in the right, we have the Rio Atoyac, the Atoyac River in Puebla and Tlaxcala here in Mexico. This is a case that I have been studying a lot previously, and where I have been myself been an activist. Basically, it is a huge river. Like right now, I close my window because I can smell it. Like that's the big issue. Like it is a river that it's so polluted by industries and water disposals, and it's a mess. Like that river has such complexity that not only industries are involved, also governments, water management authorities. It's a very complex problem, but even myself, I am close to it, and sometimes I can smell it, and I just close my window. There's people that live next to the river, and most of these people that is affected is people from indigenous backgrounds or low-income indigenous people, we can say it. So these people is being affected from their health like a lot, and they have been struggling from diseases like gastrointestinal diseases, cancer. Like there have been so many issues around this, and still the government right now is not doing enough for clean the river. Industries keep polluting, and at the end, like people that we have the privilege just to ignore it, we will do it like that, because we, like, sadly the people that have privileges in Mexico are those involved in politics and media, you know. But of course, indigenous people or people of low income don't have the same access to power. So it doesn't matter, they complain, like it's not going to bother the government, which is very, very sad. And I really like this quote by the authors, the Oliveira and Totti, and they say, environmental impacts are treated as if they were equal, but the gravity of its consequences and level of exposure is selected to non-privileged people. So yeah, like even when in policies and even when in programs, we treat, oh yeah, let's protect the earth, let's take off environmental issues and we can do it, and separate your trash and recycle and be zero waste. Like even we are saying this, we have to be very aware that these problems do not affect everyone equally, and the gravity is also very selective to certain people. So it's not that we have to fight for environmental like an equal spectrum. Like it has plenty of systemic difficulties that we also have to integrate within those solutions. And towards action, we also have environmental elitism, which has been like historically known here in Latin America. As Morrison and Dunlap were discussing, there are 3 types of environmental elitism, which means that certain people have access to that, only certain people that are mostly rich. And here in Mexico, rich people is white people still, people from Spanish backgrounds or people Spanish descendant, like that's the people that still have the power in Mexico. So there is compositional elitism that says that environmentalists belong to elites in all structures, that mean politics, NGOs, UN organizations, like how all these elite people belong to these structures. However, this happens to all structures related to politics and power. Like this is not only for environmentalism. Also, there is the ideological elitism that says that environmental reforms benefit those in privilege. That again says that reforms made to protect the environment are only done for white privileged people. And we have elitism of impact that says that environmental policies only benefit one specific sector, maybe not certain privileged people, but one specific population or one specific region, right? So there's like these types of elitism within environmentalism in Latin America. However, we can see there's a progressive transformation with empowerment of indigenous communities, of indigenous activists, with social media, with more reachable spaces to connect with other people, even internet, or having like this type of telecommunications that allow us just to gather more. Like this has been progressively changed. And I think it's very interesting to see how right now the environmental movement is rising a lot. And I think it is very interesting to see how we are changing already those structures and who are giving power back to people. And within international agreements, there are, of course, many different types of international agreements. There are different ideologies within each environmental international agreement. However, I would like to talk about how we can see white supremacy in international agreements as well, or having contrasts of that white supremacy approach. So we had the Red Plus program here in Mexico. That's what I made my dissertation about when I was doing the master's. And basically this is the program that seeks to pay people in the global south countries to keep the forests in order for developed countries to keep developed, of course, to keep polluting the way they do. So those countries pay to indigenous groups or to campesinos, farmers here in Mexico or in other southern countries. And so they keep preserving the jungles, they keep preserving endemic species, and that like taking care of that piece of land is compensated with the pollutants that they are emitting. And this program was severely criticized because it's basically saying, I want to keep polluting and I want to keep producing the things I need to maintain my power. So you people from the South, you Black, brown people, you harvest and you keep pushing sustainable forest practices so we can have a balance in the earth. But of course, the one who is in power is me, right? So we have like this whole structure of power and white supremacy within these types of programs that are not very clear when we read it, but once we start thinking about it, it's such a white supremacy approach. And on the other side, we have the Escazú Treaty, which entered yesterday, which basically it's a treaty that Latin American countries signed to protect the rights of environmental activists. And by those environmental activists, it's not activists like me that I am very comfortable talking to you right now on my computer, right? Like this treaty is for environmental activists that are risking their lives every day to go against companies, against corporations, against politicians and governments, and that sadly they are dying. So Mexico is the second place, I think, of killed environmental activists. And Colombia is the first one. So we have seen like people that are defending on first hand their lands, they are suffering a lot and being killed. So this Escazú Treaty is supposed to protect them and protect their rights. So let's see how it works. There's people that keep complaining that we already have the laws to protect them, but we are not doing it. So there is no, even we have the laws, we don't have the legal culture to execute those laws. So I think it will be very interesting to see how the Escazú Treaty works in the future. And I like to see this as it is bringing power again to people, and it's bringing rights, and it's trying to include people in the environmental crisis rather than saying like, oh, you're part of that environment, you're part of that jungle of that life. You know, it's not looking at people much more like savages, but people whose rights need to be defended as everyone else in the world. And with the climate crisis, we have the same story, because there is going to be poverty, refugees, non-remunerated activities are done by indigenous groups or Afro-Americanos. And we have these issues that most of the people that have these racial let's say they are part of this racial structure, are also part of activities that are vulnerable, like agriculture, and they have less access to information and participation. Right now it's being progressive, and we're having more access to and participation every time into politics, and having being considered within decision-making processes. But at the same time, we are still in that process. We are not done yet. So we will see how the climate crisis will be another way that people can't face environmental issues as the white counterparts or as other people with higher incomes, only because some conditions such as race, right? And with this, I'm not trying to put humanity in boxes. I'm not trying to say like, oh, you white evil person, or you indigenous saint, right? I don't want to say that. I don't want to tag people in boxes and tags. I think this is very counterproductive, if we can say it like that. I don't think that's a good way to see humanity, because exactly, we are not tags, we are not boxes, we are very complex human beings that we perform in this life in very diverse ways. And I don't want to say like, oh, you're this, you that. No, I want to say that this is a systemic issue, but it might not be something that defines completely a person just because of how they look, right? Because, for example, even myself, right, I look like an indigenous woman if you see me like long distance. And yes, I have indigenous backgrounds from my family. However, I don't consider myself an indigenous person. I just, historically, my family has come from indigenous backgrounds. But right now I'm not an indigenous person, so I cannot tag myself within that vulnerability that real indigenous groups are facing. And I would like to end with this phrase that says, systemic oppressions as racism can be a reason why people cannot face the environmental crisis equally, neither be active or are already suffering. We all have the responsibility to act in the environmental crisis, but it's also our responsibility to understand that we are all not facing it in the same way. And that's it. Thank you very much for the invitation. And that's my Instagram, that's my mail. And if you need some of the references that were here in the presentation, you can contact me, no problem. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Open to questions.
If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or just say them out loud.
Okay, so I'd like to ask, how do you think, like, we as an organization that fights for social justice around the world, how do you think we could help to fight these issues in Latin America with the pollution and all the other issues? Like, how can we contribute and assist in those issues?
You mean
like through in organizations or spreading awareness? Like, do you have any good resources for that we could make aware of to our followers and kind of spread more information about that to our community?
Yeah. I think one of the ways to help is to actually listen to people who's living in those conditions, because something that I don't like about some organizations like Greenpeace is that they are like trying to speak for Amazon indigenous people, and they're saying like posting videos and having all this content that they are distributing all around the world, and you think like, yeah, thank you, but what is actually those people saying? What do they think? So I think there are several platforms that I'm going to send you that after, when I have access to internet, about certain maps that register people that is already fighting in some causes, and they tell you like, we are doing this, we're doing that. So you can map like different environmental issues that are occurring at the same time. And other way is, for example, for you, persons that are in United States or people that is in the United States, you know, Mexico and United States have a very strong link in what is agriculture, right? We send you vegetables and fruits, and you send us cereals and different types of other resources. So it's like a very interlinked relationship. And I think from that we can think about what are also your decisions for buying. Like I think that maybe most of the fruits and vegetables that are produced for the United States here in Mexico are done through unsustainable conditions. And they are also extracting plenty of water, and they are damaging a lot the soil with extensive agriculture. So maybe one of the things that you can do is just by starting addressing these issues, like what are we eating, where is it coming from, and how we can start eating more responsibly, even it's not our country, you know. It's like having that perception. And it's the same for us, like what are we consuming here? Like what are the things we are buying from China? What are the things that we are getting also from European countries? Like, because there are many things that sometimes we already have, but we buy from importations because it's more quality things. But actually it's like there many times there are no differences, but because of racist structures we prefer things that are imported. So it's also like we should all think like what are we consuming in the place that we are, and doing our research, like what is produced locally, what can I have locally sustainably, what can I have here in where I am that is not hurting other people somewhere else.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we're going to move on to our next speaker.
Hey guys, so I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so my name's Ariel and I started Sustainably Kind. And I work with a lot of people to understand how the mindset behind being a conscious consumer and how you can sort of, once you understand that, you can look at products and consuming a little bit differently. So what is consuming? A lot of times people tend to think of consuming with clothing and fast fashion, but consuming is anything and everything you see. So that can include food and packaging materials, home decor, even the transportation emissions from the product. So basically anything that ends up in the landfill, anything that can pollute our environment or extracts resources from the earth, all of that is something that you are consuming. And so society has taught us to constantly consume and that our self-worth comes from what we own. So a lot of things that people tend to think of is like keeping up with the Joneses, the idea that you need to constantly be purchasing, have the recent model of the car or the newest Nikes, just so that you can show that you're making the same amount of money as your neighbor or your friends, and be on the same level as everybody. Another idea tends to be retail therapy. And both of these things really was a marketing idea. It wasn't, that sort of became like a social belief. So retail therapy originally was said by a journalist, and it was the idea in those days, going to the store, getting out of your house, buying something new, to make yourself feel better if you were upset or recently had a breakup or whatever it was. The idea that buying something new, looking better will really make you feel better. But we all know that doesn't solve the underlying problem. So it's sort of like any high, it lasts for a minute and then you have the same problem. And then impulse buys. So impulse buys can be shown on online, a lot of times it's like a flash sale, 24 hours, buy this now. The idea of an impulse buy is that you're not thinking about the purchase. They're trying to get you to purchase it really fast. They don't want you to think through, do I need this? Do I want this? They want you to pull the trigger immediately. Another impulse buy online could be when they say like 3 left in stock. They don't want you to think through, do I need this? It's just 3 left. I should get it before it runs out. An example in the stores a lot of times is like if you go to Marshall's or anywhere, the aisle to get down to the cashier is lined with like little trinkets that you can pick up right before you check out. So it's just the idea of like, don't think it through, buy it, you need it, you want it, keep using more resources and consuming. So that's just something we should all think through. Like, is that a moral that we all want to do? Keep continuously using resources to show that, to show our self-worth by consuming. So an idea behind this is be aware of what materials you're purchasing. This tends to help stop or help you make a more educated decision on what you're buying. So some examples, well, a lot of times for this, I tend to recommend you sitting down at home and really deciding what type of materials you want to support as a consumer, because when you go, for example, if you go to the grocery store, there's like 50 options of peanut butters and 50 options of sodas. There's just so many options that it's already overwhelming. If you're also trying to make a educated decision on the best sustainable option at the same time, it's going to be way too overwhelming. It's going to take a lot of time. So try and sit down at home and understand and research a lot of these materials. So like the difference between plastic, glass, and aluminum, when you think about it, they all have different pros and cons. So like plastic is really lightweight, so the transportation emissions are going to be lower than glass, but plastic can only be recycled 2 to 3 times. And we all know it's made from fossil fuels, so that's a whole nother like toxic aspect of it. Glass is heavier, so it does more, it produces more transportation fuels, but it can be recycled an infinite amount of times. It's easy to sanitize at home and reuse yourself. Aluminum is also light like plastic and can be recycled an infinite amount of times, but depending on the contents within it, sometimes it has a plastic liner. So for me, for example, when I go to the store and I'm buying peanut butter, your options are usually plastic or glass. So I decide that the heavier glass is better because I know I can reuse the glass within my house. If I'm looking at like carbonated soda, I tend to go for aluminum because you can recycle it an infinite amount of times and it's light. So for me, that's my best option. Other things to look at, polyester, nylon, there's synthetic fibers versus organic cotton and linen. They're natural fibers. Recycled materials versus virgin materials. So an example of that could be like virgin pulp for toilet paper and napkins. So the idea is the recycled materials coming from recycled paper and they're turning it into toilet paper versus cutting the trees down for your toilet paper. Like what kind of effect do you want to have? So really taking the time to sit down and understand all these materials before you go out to purchase them, having this understanding will really let you take a step back and make that educated decision that feels right for you. And with that idea, I try and teach people about like the linear economy, recycling economy, and circular economy. In order to really get towards a sustainable economy, we need to get towards a circular economy. Right now, I would argue we're more towards the linear economy versus the recycling economy even. So linear is taking resources out of the earth, making it into whatever product, using it, throwing it in the trash can. We don't worry about it, it fills the landfill. Recycling, taking resources out of the earth, making a product, using it, maybe recycling it 1 or 2 times, and then throwing it away in the landfill. Circular economy is taking resources, making it, using it, and then reusing it, returning it, basically repairing and recycling. So making sure that nothing is really ending up in the landfill, that you can always repair or reuse it. So that really sort of will affect the way in which we're creating items in the future. We really need to start designing them in order to be repaired and be reused. For example, right now, like computers, they're built so that every few years you need to buy a new computer. Repairing it isn't really cost effective right now, the way they've designed it. I broke my computer screen. My last computer still worked perfectly. I broke the screen. I ended up going to Apple and saying, can I just repair the screen? It wasn't cost effective to repair the screen. It was almost the same price as buying a new one. So we need to change the way our society works and the way we think about products, and making it so that we're not just saying, let's spend more money and buy, like, so that companies aren't trying to just continuously sell new items because it makes them more money. We need to build things so that we can repair them. And the reason we really need to do this is SWEEP came out with a study that predicted that by 2035, US landfills will be at capacity. And that's not far off, which is a really scary issue. And that also sort of brings up like environmental injustices, because we all know that these types of like landfills and a lot of the dumping of toxic chemicals is usually in minority neighborhoods in their backyards, because they don't have the resources to sue or really like push for these things to not be in their backyards. So that's a whole another really important issue that if we don't move towards the circular economy, it's really going to affect the minority neighborhoods a lot more. So in order to move towards this linear economy, we as consumers and companies all need to really start thinking through the life cycle assessment of a product. So that's the process of assessing environmental impacts associated with all the stages of a life cycle of a commercial product, process, or service. So these sort of include the extraction process of a resource. So that's how you take it out of the earth, whether that's metal or fossil fuels or whatever, you're even cutting down trees, so the forests, extracting it from the earth, refining process. So again, that can be taking the trees and turning it into the pulp for the toilet paper, how we're taking things and turning it into the item that we need. The factory pollution, this is through the factories, we really aren't paying attention right now to the pollution that they tend to throw in the environment. So an example of that would be clothing. So any dyes from clothing is actually really toxic, and it comes out in the water systems. And a lot of the factories tend to dump it in local water waste streams, which really is really toxic for the local communities. So we need to pay attention to how factories are working. Packaging, and I do want to say, so a lot of the ways to sort of do a circular economy is buying secondhand, but I do want to point out that a lot of the life cycle assessment does still participate within secondhand. So that is something to still think about. So packaging, that's what the item is coming in, whether you're buying it from Amazon and it's coming in a recycled paper box or plastic, that does still have to get shipped to you when it's secondhand, or the idea of it being shipped to a store. If anyone's worked in retail, you know that an item tends to come in a box wrapped in plastic, in a bigger box, in a bigger box. It's kind of ridiculous. So shipping and transportation emissions is another one. Everything needs to be shipped to a store or shipped to you. You also drive to stores, so all of this is part of the item that you're consuming. the life cycle pollutants. So if this is clothing, the microplastics from washing it. So certain items have life cycle pollutants. If it requires electricity, then that's a pollutant as well. And the end of life cycle responsibility, currently that is on the consumer. It's not on the company that makes it. So companies aren't responsible for recycling anything or making sure that it doesn't end up in the ocean or wherever. This is on us as consumers. So we need to take that responsibility to heart. So when we're buying something, we really should think about, is it recyclable? Are parts of it recyclable? Can you compost it? Or does it have to end up in the landfill? If it's ending up in the landfill, do we really want to purchase it? Or are there other options for us to maybe look at? But that's definitely a part that we need to think through the end life when we'll have to throw it out. And I know greenwashing was touched on, but I do want to go through this a little bit because I'll go through it kind of quick, but it has been shown in studies that companies, so a lot of companies are doing a lot of greenwashing right now, which is basically just making the consumer believe that their product's a little more sustainable than it truly is. And a lot of them are doing this right now simply because it's shown that the trend is sustainable products. So they found that if a product is marketed as sustainable or eco, whether it is or isn't, it sells at 5.6 higher rate. And so it's our responsibility sort of like to take a step back, look at the product, decide if it's truly sustainable. So some of the examples that I have here are like the Bic razor. It says it's eco-plastic, but it's still a one-time use, which means it's pretty much greenwashing because it's being thrown out. Most people most likely don't have composts in their backyard, so they are still throwing it out after 1 or 2 times of using it. Another example I have here are these eco cups. So the product itself might not be trying to greenwash it because these are usually compostable, but also look at where you're getting it. I've seen a lot of coffee shops have these compostable cups, but then they'll have a trash can and they'll have a recycle bin, and they don't have a compost bin. So ultimately, it's still ending up in the trash or the landfill because the company that's offering this to you to use isn't sending it to where it needs to go. Because unless you're taking this cup yourself to a compost bin, it's still ending up in the trash. So really thinking through everything that you use and see and how it truly is sustainable or where it's going to end up at the end of life. So 5 things to ask yourself before making a purchase. These are just a few things, but I find that when you sort of take a step back before making a purchase, you usually realize you probably don't need it. So do I have a similar item? Can I purchase it secondhand? Is there a sustainable alternative? A lot of times that takes a little research to see if other companies are doing things more sustainable. Will I use it only a few times? And can I borrow it instead? So if you're only using it a few times, that's usually where you go to, like, can I borrow it if I'm only going to use it 3 times? So like for wedding dresses, I usually don't buy fancy dresses because I know I need it for one occasion, once a year. I tend to just go ask friends if I can borrow their dresses, and they're happy because it's getting used. You dry clean it, send it back. And it's just less resources being extracted from the earth. And then accessibility, I think, is still a really important thing to talk about when we're talking about being a conscious consumer, because we need to recognize that a lot of sustainable brands are usually more expensive, and that's not an option that everybody can take. So to me, I think there's always an option that people can use that works right for their lifestyle and where they're at. So option 1, if you can afford a sustainable brand, that's great. You should do it, because this tends to push the demand towards sustainable options, which will bring down the price all around. Option 2, shop at your normal stores, but look at the materials being used. So see if you can find, for example, clothing. See if you can find natural resource, natural fibers, so cotton, linen, silk. And then instead of buying maybe 5 dresses, go down to 1. It's just the idea of you can still do what you're doing and do it at the normal stores, but maybe minimize. Option 3 is purchasing secondhand. It's cheaper, it helps save resources, but you're still getting something new to you. So there's different price points that we can try and find that works for everybody's lifestyle. But it's just putting in the effort and the time and the effort to find what works right for you. So that's it for me. I tried going a little fast since I know we were past time, but if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. My Instagram's there, my website. Feel free to message me at any time.
Thank you so much. That was so great. That was so
Yeah.
interesting.
Oh, oops. I don't have, okay. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, can move on to the next presenter.
I just have a question. What do you think about the new life cycle assessments that are emerging? Like I've heard that there is this social social justice life cycle assessment. Like there are many different types of assessments, and some people is like criticizing it because it doesn't have many data. There's not enough data. There's not enough methodologies developed. So
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be like none of it's going to be a perfect assessment, but I do think you should, like, for social life cycle, like social assessment, I do think that should be part of the life cycle assessment. So looking at the labor rights and the workers, a lot of that has to do with finding a sustainable company, look for third-party labels, fair trade. There are some like the GOTS label for clothes. B Corp means that, so B Corp's really strict and it looks at a lot of the employee rights. So I do think that that should be a part of your assessment, because I think that paying worker rights, paying workers like salaries and good payments, like, is really important for sustainability.
Okay, if no one else. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you learned from our incredible speakers and continue to support us and the organizations we are donating to.